Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the colossal machinery of modern life, the infrastructure, the finance, the history, and distill it down into the core facts and surprising insights that shape our world.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into Ameren Corporation. This company is, quite literally, the indispensable power engine for a huge swath of the American Midwest.
When you think about infrastructure, utilities often feel like this monolithic, almost invisible force until your power bill or a storm hits.
Right.
But understanding the sheer scale and complexity of a company like Ameren is crucial, not just for financial literacy, but for understanding public health, environmental history, and state regulatory policy.
Exactly. Ameren is listed on the NYSE under AEE. It's an S&P 500 component, and it operates across a staggering 64,000 square miles.
64,000.
Yeah, stretching across central and eastern Missouri, and then the southern 4/5 of Illinois.
Yep.
That service area alone just defines the scope of their responsibility.
And what does that translate to in terms of customer base? Because that's the public trust we're talking about here.
They serve approximately 2.4 million electric customers and about 900,000 natural gas customers.
Wow.
When you look at those numbers, you move past just looking at a corporate logo and start seeing a critical historical entity. Ameren is a holding company, but its story is one of rapid consolidation built on infrastructure that is, in some cases, almost a century old.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to trace that history, to understand the corporate maneuvering that created this power giant in the 1990s and 2000s, and most critically, to grapple with the massive environmental and regulatory liabilities that come attached to operating such essential yet often ailing assets.
Right.
This is the story of keeping the lights on at a pretty significant cost.
It really is.
Utility formation is never a simple business launch. It's almost always a combination of deeply rooted, highly capital-intensive local monopolies. And Ameren is the textbook example of this, emerging from the convergence of two significant players in the late 1990s.
That's right. The formal birth of Ameren Corporation occurred on December 31st, 1997.
New Year's Eve.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a merger of two previously NYSE-listed companies, Union Electric Company, or UE, out of St. Louis, Missouri, and Central Illinois Public Service Company, CIPSDO, Inc., from Springfield, Illinois.
And the scale difference between the two precursors is important to note here. Union Electric was listed at the time of the merger as roughly twice the size of CIPSO.
It was.
This wasn't a merger of equals in terms of asset base, but rather the creation of a unified regional powerhouse.
And the financial context really explains why this merger happened when it did. The initial agreement was actually struck in 1995, and it was driven heavily by the need to manage massive historical liabilities, specifically the long-term debt these companies had accrued.
Mostly from building things out in the 80s.
Primarily from the expansive infrastructure build-outs of the 1980s, yes.
Can you put some numbers on that debt? Because it illustrates the sheer weight they were carrying.
Certainly. So Union Electric, despite having assets listed near $600 million, carried substantial long-term debt around $1.8 billion.
Wow. 3 times its asset value.
Exactly. And while that's significant, it was actually a reduction from a staggering high of $2.5 billion in debt earlier in the 1980s.
So they were already trying to dig themselves out.
They were. And CIPSEO was similarly leveraged. It had assets around $210 million, but was carrying nearly $500 million in long-term debt from that same period.
So the merger wasn't just about operational synergy. It was a financial consolidation strategy. Combining forces lets them leverage scale, refinance debt under better terms, and, maybe stabilize future rates by spreading those costs over a much bigger customer base.
Precisely. They were seeking economy of scale to manage these substantial historical obligations and, of course, the ongoing need for capital expenditure. So once the merger was approved, they needed a new unifying corporate identity.
And they settled on Ameren. Why such a broad, national-sounding name like American Energy, especially for two distinctly Midwestern utilities?
It's a classic corporate naming convention of the late 90s, isn't it? It's a portmanteau of American Energy.
Right.
It signaled ambition and scale beyond their immediate geographic borders, even if their operations remain local. Following the merger, the name sort of reflected their origins. Union Electric became Ameren UE, which is now Ameren Missouri, and CIPSCO became Ameren CIPS.
Before Ameren, there was Union Electric, and this company wasn't just connecting wires. It was fundamentally shaping the physical landscape and, the hydrology of Missouri. Let's look at the infrastructure projects that define their legacy.
The story starts deep in the infrastructure age. The most monumental project was the 1929 completion of the Bagnell Dam on the Osage River. This was a massive undertaking, generating almost 175 megawatts of crucial hydroelectricity.
Okay, but its defining legacy is geographical, right?
Yeah.
It created the Lake of the Ozarks.
It created the Lake of the Ozarks.
That's a staggering civil engineering feat that had unintended massive consequences for recreation and development. I mean, it's a huge tourist destination.
Absolutely. The Lake of the Ozarks has 1,400 miles. That's 2,300 kilometers of shoreline.
1,400 miles.
Think about that. Ameren, Missouri, through the ownership of that dam, effectively manages a coastline larger than the state of California's.
That's unbelievable.
Their operational scope extends far beyond electricity into federal water management and, shoreline regulation.
And they continued their hydro expansion pretty early on.
2 years later, in 1931, Union Electric acquired the Keokuk Dam in Iowa. This added another 134 megawatts of hydroelectric capacity. What was technologically impressive here was that the power was successfully carried over a significantly greater distance than previous attempts.
So that signaled their edge in long-distance transmission, which is really the groundwork for the modern grid.
It laid the groundwork for the modern regional grid structure, absolutely.
Union Electric wasn't solely focused on power generation, though. They diversified early into natural gas.
By the 1950s, yes. Union Electric had expanded into gas distribution, particularly around Alton, Illinois. They grew to become the third largest natural gas distributor in the entire state of Missouri, adding another layer of complex utility regulation and infrastructure to their portfolio.
Then we shift to the pump storage model, which is a high-tech solution for storing energy that we talk about a lot today, but this was back in the 60s.
It was. In 1963, they completed the Taum Sauk plant, a 350-megawatt pumped storage facility in Reynolds County, Missouri. This was a massive technical achievement. It involves pumping water uphill during times of low demand and then releasing it through turbines when peak power is needed.
It's basically a giant water battery.
However, as we will discuss later, Taum Sauk is now intrinsically linked to one of Ameren's most damaging incidents.
Right. And finally, the move into nuclear power, establishing themselves as a true multi-fuel generating company.
In 1984, the Callaway Nuclear Generating Station began operations, providing 11,143 megawatts of highly reliable, baseload power. So decades before the Ameren merger, Union Electric had already built an extraordinarily diverse and large-scale asset base: hydro, gas distribution, pump storage, and nuclear.
So with that foundation set in 1997, the next decade was really defined by Ameren's aggressive consolidation strategy, primarily focused on absorbing the rest of downstate Illinois.
The groundwork for this was actually set much, much earlier. In 1952, three Midwestern utilities, CIPS, Union Electric, and Illinois Power, formed what was called the Midwest Power Pool.
A power pool, okay.
It was a non-binding agreement to share and pool energy for reliability. It established a technical and operational relationship that Ameren later capitalized on.
And Ameren's corporate strategy seemed to be to acquire the entire pool. It sounds like they went on a shopping spree starting in the early 2000s.
That's one way to put it. In 2003, they acquired Peoria-based Silcorp, which is Central Illinois Light Company, or Silco, from AES Corporation. Silco was historically significant. It was noted for its financial stability as a pioneer utility that had continuously paid dividends since 1921.
A very stable asset to acquire.
Very. And this acquisition created Ameren Silco.
So they acquired Silco, known for its financial reliability, and then immediately went after the third partner in that power pool.
That happened in 2004 with the acquisition of the Illinois Power Company, or IP, from Denji Inc. Illinois Power was primarily a generating company, deriving almost all its electricity from coal plants in the late 1980s, alongside its natural gas distribution. IP was then reorganized into Ameren IP.
This purchase was the definitive move then. It essentially cemented Ameren's position as the primary investor-owned power company covering the entire southern 4/5 of Illinois.
Absolutely. You had three major Illinois utilities, each with its own history, its own rate structures, infrastructure, and debt, all brought under the Ameren Holding Company umbrella in really quick succession.
And that must have led to some kind of administrative mess.
It led to an inevitable administrative restructuring in 2010.
And this restructuring is crucial for understanding the consumer landscape today.
It is. In 2010, the three Illinois operating companies, Ameren CIPS, Ameren Silco, and Ameren IP, were legally merged into a single entity, the Ameren Illinois Company. This was a major efficiency move for management and operations.
But wait, if they merged three different companies, they must have had three different sets of historical costs and regulatory agreements. How does that translate to the consumer today?
That's the complex part. While it's one operational entity, the service territory is still segmented into three distinct rate zones: Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3.
Right.
And these zones correspond precisely to the service areas of the former individual companies. The reason this persists is that historical infrastructure investments, localized debt obligations, and specific regulatory decisions were made at the company level decades ago.
So those costs are legally baked into the rates for the customers in those specific areas.
Exactly, meaning your neighbor across the rate zone line might have a fundamentally different cost structure, even if the power lines look exactly the same.
That detail perfectly illustrates the challenge of deregulation and utility consolidation. You can consolidate the infrastructure, but you can't easily erase decades of varied financial history that were approved by regulators. It's fascinating.
On the Missouri side, the change was simpler. On that same date in 2010, Ameren UE formally changed its name to the Ameren Missouri Company.
So we have a clear picture of how this corporate giant was assembled. Through decades of massive, diverse infrastructure building, followed by a rapid, debt management-driven acquisition phase that consolidated nearly all non-Chicago power assets in the region.
That's the story in a nutshell.
Okay, so now we move from the history books to the current operational reality. Here's where it gets really interesting. The day-to-day scope of Ameren is immense. I mean, it involves federal dam regulation, nuclear asset management, and operating a truly massive, complex, high-voltage grid.
Let's start with the service area detail. Ameren, Illinois and Ameren, Missouri distribute power and gas across their designated territories, which include St. Louis and vast stretches of central and southern Illinois. But we need to stress that key exclusion again.
Right, they don't serve Chicago.
They specifically exclude the most densely populated region, the Chicago metropolitan area.
Why is that distinction so important?
Because it defines Ameren's operational profile. The utility serving Chicago, which is ComEd, deals with intense population density over a small area. That requires specific investments in urban infrastructure. Ameren, by contrast, manages a sprawling territory.
So their challenge is distance.
Their challenge is scale and distance, not hyperdensity. They require enormous investment in high-voltage transmission and substation infrastructure to reach smaller, dispersed populations across rural and suburban areas.
And as this massive holding company, what are the primary points of the corporate machine today?
Ameren Corporation holds four major subsidiaries. Ameren, Missouri, which serves 1.2 million power and about 110,000 gas customers, primarily in the St. Louis metro.
Okay.
Then there's Ameren, Illinois, which manages that consolidated Illinois territory we talked about, Ameren Transmission Company, and Ameren Services, which handles centralized support functions like IT and HR.
The transmission lines themselves are the backbone of the operation. We listed a variety of voltages: 345 kV, 230 kV, 161 kV, down to 34.5 kV. Why is managing that complexity of varying voltage levels such a huge undertaking?
Well, it matters intensely for reliability and stability. The high voltages, like 345 kV and 230 kV, those are the superhighways. They carry bulk power over vast distances from generation plants like Callaway Nuclear or Labadie Coal to major load centers.
And the lower voltages?
The lower voltages, like 69 kV and 34.5 kV, act as the local feeder roads, distributing power from substations to communities. Managing this complex, multi-tiered network requires precise monitoring, sophisticated software, and a massive capital outlay to meet mandatory NERC standards.
NERC being the North American Electric Reliability Corporation.
That's right. If a 345 kV line fails, the cascade effect can be regional. It's a huge responsibility.
Let's pivot to the energy portfolio. Like all utilities, Ameren has faced regulatory pressure to transition away from coal and integrate renewables. What steps have they taken to diversify their generation mix?
One early and critical move came in 2009. Ameren UE committed to purchasing 102 megawatts of wind power from Phase 2 of Horizon Wind Energy's Pioneer Prairie Wind Farm in Iowa.
Okay, 102 megawatts. And this was important because it fulfilled a specific regulatory commitment, right? This wasn't just them being proactive.
That's a key point. It fulfilled a specific commitment Ameren UE had made to Missouri state regulators, adding a 100 MW of renewable capacity to serve Missouri customers by 2010.
So this wasn't just a corporate choice. It was meeting a state-mandated goal. That 100 milliW is enough to power tens of thousands of homes, but in the context of their total generation capacity, which includes the 11,143 milliW Callaway nuclear plant, it's still a small piece of the pie.
It illustrates the incremental nature of utility transition. But the most unique and complex asset they manage is their hydroelectric system, particularly the Bagnell Dam and the Lake of the Ozarks.
That's a coastline bigger than California's.
Exactly. This is where Ameren's regulatory reach extends beyond power and into environmental and, really, municipal governance.
How does their responsibility for the Lake of the Ozarks go beyond just generating electricity?
Well, Ameren, Missouri owns the dam and is federally licensed by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to operate the facility. That license dictates water level management, which has huge implications for everything from flood control to recreational boating.
So they're managing the lake itself.
But because the creation of the lake was tied to the creation of the utility, Ameren also regulates all development within what's called the Osage project boundary.
So they're essentially the property authority for 1,400 miles of shoreline.
Effectively, yes. They are responsible for issuing permits for boat docks, seawalls, breakwaters, and other permanent structures. They maintain a dedicated lake and shoreline protection hotline and run programs like Adopt the Shoreline for litter control.
That's not typical utility work. That's quasi-governmental.
It is, and it's a constant source of friction because every lakeside property owner is dealing with a power company that acts as their zoning board.
That's a huge burden of public relations and regulatory compliance that is entirely separate from simply delivering electrons. Speaking of structure, Ameren is a major utility, so its ownership must reflect that stability.
That's right. As of 2017 data, Ameren shares are predominantly held by institutional investors. We're talking about the largest fund managers in the world: Vanguard Group, BlackRock, State Street Corporation.
The usual suspects?
The usual suspects. They invest in utilities because they are stable, regulated entities that provide reliable dividends and predictable cash flow, which is exactly what these massive institutional funds are looking for.
Moving from operations to corporate evolution, how is Ameren preparing for the future grid? They seem to be making investments in innovation rather than just relying on legacy assets.
That is necessary given the complexity of their aging network. In 2015, Ameren took a significant step by becoming the first major energy company to open an innovation center at the research park at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
What's the practical benefit of a utility opening an innovation center like that? What are they working on?
It signals a dedication to modernizing the grid. Specifically, they're focusing on smart grid technology, cybersecurity, predictive maintenance, and integrating intermittent renewables like solar and wind effectively.
So finding ways to make their vast, sprawling infrastructure more reliable and resilient.
Exactly, especially against severe weather events, which are becoming more frequent.
And on the human resources side, they have received recognition for their workplace environment, which suggests they're investing in talent retention.
That is key for a technical enterprise like this. In 2016, Ameren was cited as 10th on Business Insider's list of best energy companies to work for in America.
That's pretty high.
It is, and the statistic that jumps out is that 74% of employees felt their job had high meaning. In an industry facing massive workforce turnover, retaining skilled engineers and technical staff is absolutely critical to maintaining complex facilities like nuclear plants and major dams.
Finally, let's ground ourselves in the sheer financial weight of the company. Let's use, say, fiscal year 2020 data.
The numbers confirm the scale. In FY 2020, Ameren reported revenues nearing $5.8 billion. Their total assets were a colossal $32.030 billion, which generated a net income of $871 million.
And those assets aren't just sitting there. They require constant upkeep.
Continuous, multi-billion-dollar capital expenditure cycles just to ensure that the lights stay on across 64,000 square miles, while also trying to meet modern compliance standards. The maintenance cost of this legacy infrastructure is astronomical.
We've established Ameren's scale and the historical debt load they inherited. Now we have to turn to the consequences of operating this massive aging infrastructure. The reality is that immense infrastructure carries immense risk, and Ameren has faced catastrophic failures and enormous regulatory penalties as a result.
And we must start with the Taum Sauk disaster.
Right, the giant water battery.
The Taum Sauk pumped storage plant, which we noted earlier as a 1963 engineering marvel, became synonymous with negligence in December 2005. On December 14th, the upper reservoir failed catastrophically. The dam breached, unleashing over 1 billion gallons of water in less than half an hour.
1 billion gallons. That's an unimaginable volume of water released as an environmental torrent, impacting the natural landscape immediately downstream.
The environmental damage was widespread and devastating. It caused extensive damage to the East Fork of the Black River, and critically, it obliterated sections of Johnson's Shut-In State Park, which is one of Missouri's crown jewels for natural recreation.
And the regulatory response must have been severe.
FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, fined Ameren $15 million. But more importantly, the state of Missouri sued Ameren for actual and punitive damages.
And what was the core allegation?
The central allegation was that Ameren had recklessly operated the plant. The state argued the company prioritized maximizing power sales, running the pumps hard when energy prices were good over sound engineering, safety checks, and basic maintenance procedures.
And the detail about the operational oversight, or lack thereof, is key to the negligence claim.
It is a critical finding. During the pumping operations at the time of the failure, the plant was operated entirely by remote control. There was no one physically on site to monitor the water level sensors or respond to immediate warnings before the breach occurred.
So a model that prioritized cost efficiency was directly linked to the catastrophe.
Directly.
What was the remediation and the ultimate cost of this failure?
The rebuilding was a monumental undertaking that cost Ameren $450 million.
Almost $500 million.
They had to completely reconstruct the upper reservoir. When it reopened in 2010, the new 54.5-acre reservoir was constructed using roller-compacted concrete, or RCC, making it the largest RCC dam in North America, built to be inherently safer and more robust than the original structure.
Moving from a physical disaster to a regulatory battle, Ameren has been repeatedly challenged over its compliance with the Clean Air Act, focusing heavily on its legacy coal plants. Let's unpack the specifics of the Rush Island plant litigation.
This specific legal action began in 2011 when the U.S. EPA filed suit against Ameren, Missouri concerning excess sulfur dioxide, or SO2, emissions from the Rush Island plant in Festus, Missouri.
And the core issue wasn't the plant's age, but Ameren's actions while operating it. What exactly did the EPA allege Ameren did wrong?
The allegations centered on specific environmental regulations. The EPA claimed Ameren undertook major modifications at Rush Island between 2007 and 2010. According to the Clean Air Act, if you undertake a major modification that causes a significant net emissions increase at an old facility, you trigger a whole set of rules.
The New Source Review rules.
Exactly. The Prevention of Significant Deterioration, or PSD, provisions of the New Source Review program.
And the requirement triggered by those rules is that you must install the best available pollution technology. You can't just do a patch job.
That's it. The EPA argued Ameren made these changes without getting the required permits or installing the necessary pollution controls, effectively extending the plant's life and increasing its pollution footprint illegally. In January 2017, the district court agreed.
They found them liable.
The judge explicitly stated the company violated the Clean Air Act without obtaining the necessary permits, installing best available pollution technology, and otherwise meeting applicable requirements.
That is a definitive ruling. The judge then mandated the remedy, pollution controls.
The court ordered Ameren to equip the Rush Island coal plant with scrubbers, the technology required to dramatically cut SO2 emissions. However, Ameren made a calculated corporate decision that speaks volumes about the economics of environmental compliance.
Which was to close the plant entirely rather than pay for the retrofit.
Yes. Ameren chose to close the Rush Island plant in 2024, 15 years ahead of its anticipated scheduled operational lifespan, citing the massive expense of installing the pollution technology the court mandated.
So it was financially simpler and likely cheaper in the long run to shut down the generation source than to comply.
That's what their math told them.
That decision sets an enormous precedent. The cost of compliance, even if court-ordered, can exceed the value of the asset.
It does, but we should note a critical judicial complication tied to that ruling. The judge also attempted to order scrubbers installed on another Ameren facility, the Labadie plant, as part of the overall remedy.
But that was overturned.
A federal appeals court overturned that specific condition.
Why was the Labadie part of the ruling tossed out?
Because the government had never properly noticed or alleged a specific Clean Air Act violation related to Labadie within the scope of that particular Rush Island case. It underscores the highly technical nature of environmental litigation. You can only impose remedies for violations that were properly alleged and proven in court.
Which brings us directly to the Labadie Energy Center, which, despite avoiding that ruling's remedy, remains Ameren's most environmentally scrutinized asset. And this plant's pollution footprint is staggering, largely because it lacks the scrubbers the Rush Island plant was mandated to install.
That's the heart of the issue. Labadie, located in Franklin County, Missouri, is the largest coal-fired power plant in the state. And its defining characteristic, as you noted, is that it is one of the few large coal plants that still operates without sulfur dioxide scrubbers.
And in the national context, what does that translate to in terms of pollution output?
It means Labadie is currently the country's highest emitter of sulfur dioxide.
Highest.
The highest. To put that into perspective, a public report indicated that even if Ameren managed to cut Labadie's SO2 emissions in half, the plant would still emit more SO2 than all but 2 other coal plants nationwide. This facility is a massive outlier.
That level of pollution has a measurable, tragic human cost. We need to let the public health data associated with Labadie sink in.
This is where the numbers become visceral. Beyond SO2, Labadie is also the second largest producer of greenhouse gases among the nation's coal plants, according to EPA data. But the most shocking finding comes from a 2024 study that utilized Medicare records.
And what did that study conclude regarding mortality?
It estimated that between 1999 and 2020, approximately 4,000 deaths were linked to the fine particulate matter emissions emanating from Labadie.
4,000.
To emphasize the scale of this societal cost, this was significantly more estimated deaths than any other coal plant across the 7 Midwestern states covered in the study.
4,000 estimated deaths over 20 years linked to the emissions from a single facility. That statistic moves this discussion out of regulatory fines and into a profound public health crisis that is localized to Ameren's service territory.
It does.
That is the ultimate societal cost of maintaining legacy infrastructure without modern pollution controls.
That gravity cannot be overstated, and the plant has a similar regulatory history to Rush Island, which suggests a pattern of non-compliance regarding upgrades.
What were the historical violations at Labadie?
Labadie received its own notices of Clean Air Act violations from the EPA in at least 2010 and 2011, cited for undertaking major modifications that caused a significant net emissions increase without obtaining the proper permits. The pattern is identical to Rush Island.
Even though the specific case against Rush Island couldn't legally mandate scrubbers on Labadie.
Exactly.
And the pressure on Ameren regarding Labadie continues today.
It does. As recently as 2023, the Sierra Club included Labadie among the 17 deadliest coal plants in the U.S., actively calling on the EPA to implement new regulations specifically designed to curb these harmful emissions. The future of this plant is arguably the single largest environmental and health liability Ameren currently manages.
Finally, the story of Ameren's liabilities often involves assets they inherited through that long consolidation process. Let's look at the problem of manufactured gas plant, or MGP, contamination.
This takes us to Columbia, Missouri. Decades ago, long before Ameren existed, a local utility company operated a coal gasification plant. This was common technology for lighting and heating before widespread natural gas use. The plant was eventually demolished.
But the pollution stayed behind.
The process of turning coal into gas left behind heavy, long-lasting contamination in the soil and groundwater, specifically with carcinogenic chemicals.
So Ameren, through their acquisition trail, inherited the cleanup responsibility for a highly toxic site that they never operated. What does that cleanup process look like?
Ameren has been actively involved in remediation for years. For example, they were removing contaminated soil in June 2014. However, this is a slow, methodical process, and the lingering presence of a dormant, toxic site in an urban area creates friction.
And that friction leads to public criticism, connecting environmental history directly to contemporary urban planning.
Precisely. The local North Village Board of Directors publicly criticized Ameren, citing that the company owned a whole city block that is in disrepair and for an aversion to commerce. This contamination created a dead zone in a developing part of the city.
A dead zone, yeah.
As of 2019, the city of Columbia was considering purchasing the cleaned-up lot from Ameren to convert it into a public park, illustrating just how long the shadow of historical environmental liability can extend.
This entire section really reinforces the central tension. You cannot acquire 100 years of infrastructure without acquiring 100 years of environmental debt.
It comes with the territory.
Ameren is operating in a world demanding clean energy transitions, grid resilience, and investment in future technology. Given the massive liabilities they are managing from the past, where is their focus for the future? One area where utilities are expected to lead is in electric vehicle infrastructure.
Ameren has certainly attempted to move into the EV space, but their initial attempts were instructive regarding the challenges of utility regulation. In 2016, Ameren proposed a pilot program to install EV charging stations. This was a clear attempt to get ahead of the transition.
But state utility regulators rejected oversight of the project, leading Ameren to cancel it. Why is regulatory oversight so critical for a charging station program? It seems like a simple investment.
It's purely financial. When a regulated utility invests substantial capital in infrastructure, they need assurance from the State Public Service Commission or the regulator that they will be allowed to recover those investments, plus a reasonable profit margin through customer rates.
Through the rate base.
Exactly. If the state regulators reject oversight, that assurance vanishes. Ameren could not risk billions in unrecoverable investments, so they canceled the program immediately.
That perfectly explains the difference between a competitive market company and a regulated utility. A utility's hands are tied unless they have a clear path to cost recovery.
It's the core of utility finance. However, they successfully navigated the regulatory hurdles shortly thereafter. In early 2018, Ameren successfully launched the Charge Ahead program.
So they got it done eventually.
They did. This program provides significant incentives, supporting the installation of approximately 1,200 charging stations and offering incentives for the adoption of commercial electric vehicles. So it shows their renewed commitment once that regulatory certainty was established.
Beyond EVs, given the immense pressure from shareholders and regulators regarding climate change, what is Ameren's general future focus in terms of their energy mix and carbon targets?
Ameren has publicly outlined significant long-term carbon reduction goals, which, necessitate moving away from their reliance on coal assets like Labadie. Their integrated resource plan for Missouri, for example, includes targets to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2045.
That is an extremely ambitious timeline for a company with such a heavy reliance on legacy fossil fuel plants. How are they planning to achieve that? That's not a simple switch.
It involves three main strategies. First, decommissioning the remaining coal fleet, which includes Labadie, though the timeline for that plan is constantly scrutinized.
Of course.
Second, massive investment in renewable generation, primarily utility-scale solar and wind. And third, significant upgrades to the transmission grid. That's where the Ameren Transmission Company comes in. They need a resilient grid capable of handling intermittent renewable energy from remote locations.
And all of that costs billions.
Continuous billions in capital expenditure.
Let's talk about a physical asset that represents their dual nature, the mix of high-voltage transmission and other technologies. The Ameren UE Tower, near their St. Louis headquarters, is a very unique structure.
It is a fascinating engineering compromise. Built in 2009, it's a 111-meter-tall lattice steel structure that uniquely combines an electricity pylon and a radio tower. It's an example of maximizing utility on a compact urban footprint.
What specific electrical function does it serve?
It carries two 138 kV circuits on 3 crossbars, approximately at its mid-height. This is medium to high voltage power distribution for the St. Louis metropolitan area.
But the combination of functions actually creates a serious operational conflict. It sounds efficient, but maintenance must be a nightmare.
The conflict arises because the tower's height is dictated by its function as a radio tower, making it significantly taller than it would need to be merely as a pylon. The high-voltage infrastructure, the crossbars and power conductors, are located at the precise elevation where you would want clear access for radio equipment maintenance.
So when they need to work on the antennas, what's the complexity?
Well, the physical presence of those high-voltage circuits significantly hampers the installation or maintenance of larger antennas using typical tools like cranes or pulleys. In many cases, Ameren is required to shut down the high-voltage circuits entirely just to perform routine maintenance or upgrades on the radio equipment.
So it adds immense complexity, cost, and scheduling difficulties to simple tasks, all because of that dual-purpose design.
It's a physical manifestation of the compromise inherent in utility management.
We have taken a deep dive into the Ameren Corporation, charting a course from 2 debt-laden mergers in the 1990s through decades of infrastructure building, federal dam management, and confronting staggering environmental liabilities. So what does this all mean when we synthesize this complex history for the listener?
The central tension of Ameren's existence is defined by the incredible public trust placed in them as an infrastructure provider. Managing nuclear assets, complex hydro ecosystems like the Lake of the Ozarks, and the entire regional grid.
Right.
Yet this operation is fundamentally built upon a history of aggressive consolidation and inherited liabilities, which directly collide with modern environmental regulations.
We saw that collision play out dramatically in the courts.
Indeed. What's fascinating here is the clear link between the historical debt loads of the original companies, the rapid acquisition phase of the 2000s, and the resulting regulatory challenges. The lawsuits involving Taum Sauk, Rush Island, and especially Labadie show the immense financial and operational difficulty in navigating compliance with environmental laws like the Clean Air Act.
These facilities were built in an era with different standards, and retrofitting or replacing them demands capital expenditures that sometimes threaten the financial viability of the asset itself.
And that takes us back to the stark reality of the Labadie Energy Center. The fact that this plant remains the country's highest emitter of sulfur dioxide lacking scrubbers is a highly sensitive topic. The estimated link to approximately 4,000 deaths from fine particulate matter emissions over a two-decade period cannot be separated from the conversation about utility regulation and cost recovery.
The decisions Ameren makes regarding legacy pollution are not just accounting entries. They are public health determinants for the entire region.
Exactly. We've seen that utility regulation has to constantly seek equilibrium. It must ensure stable, recoverable investment, as shown by the hiccup they faced with the EV program when regulators balked at cost recovery,
Right.
while at the same time enforcing regulations that address the overwhelming societal costs of legacy pollution. It is a balancing act between the regulated bottom line and the human cost of air quality.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider.
Given the stark data that a single Ameren facility, Labadie, has been linked to thousands of estimated deaths through its air pollution, and given that the utility is legally entitled to recover its necessary investments through customer rates, how should state and federal regulators structure utility economics? Should the cost of installing necessary pollution control technology, estimated to be astronomical, be prioritized immediately, even if it causes a dramatic spike in utility rates, thereby passing the full historical cost of pollution onto current ratepayers?
Or should those costs be deferred and managed slowly, prolonging the exposure risks for the public?
The debate over Ameren's coal fleet is a perfect defining case study of public health versus utility economics in the 21st century.